First of all, I have to say, I'm really excited as a Catholic to be preaching in a Protestant church about Protestantism in 16th century Venice. It's a subject that I would have never thought to be drawn to if you had asked me just a few years ago. There are some people in the audience who know how I came to be kind of hooked, so to speak, on the work of the Venetian master Lorenzo Lotto, who was, as I'm sure many of you know, was a contemporary of the big names, Titian, etc., and was sort of second rank in many ways, in the sense that he wasn't as commercially successful as they were. Maybe not as productive, maybe more of a reclusive type also, by all accounts, and a more sort of brooding character, as he's been variously described. And that alone didn't hook me, and I guess I only learned about these character traits later on. And I have to admit that I'm even not 100% sure anymore how exactly where the point was that I was hooked. I think it was a playing together of certain different experiences that I had that at some point somehow clicked, in the sense that I started to suspect, so to speak, and of course I wasn't the very first one to have that suspicion, that Lorenzo Lotto had more than just only interest in Protestantism, but some kind of deeper interest, maybe even sympathy. We don't know exactly, because he never expressly, there's no source that confirms that in that sense. But there, I think, are traits and indications in his work and parallels that struck me as quite surprising, because we have so many assumptions, and I would say that the tradition in art history has many assumptions that I first came about when I, for example, tried to learn more about this painting that some of you might know from the National Gallery in London. Lorenzo Lotto, Portrait of a Lady as Lucrezia, from circa 1533. It's quite an unusual portrait, even for the time, starting from the format. I mean, the usual format was portrait format. Lorenzo Lotto made several landscape format portraits, and it's quite unique for the time. And he used the space to the left and right of the person to add certain attributes and certain indications of a situation that sometimes has been described as sort of also a sort of psychological realm. I'm not sure about that. I'm more sort of thinking along the lines of several layers of meaning that he purposefully put on top of each other, so to speak. And that was my starting point. Varied a well-known topic, portraits of Lucrezia, in a very curious manner, starting with the fact that the lady in the image points to a depiction of Lucrezia rather than impersonating her herself, as in many other, some of which I will show later. And then there's other curious details. If you read the sort of, I would say, orthodox literature about that painting, you will immediately be told, oh, well, this is a bridal portrait, because she has a certain gown in her hair, which is connected to being a bride. And of course, the allegory is usually described that Lucrezia is the figure of chastity, because in the old Roman story, she's the one who gets molested by the son of the tyrant, and to prevent her family from disgrace, she committed suicide with a dagger. And I'll come back to that. But before, let me just quickly show you another portrait from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, Portrait of a Goldsmith in 3 positions. It shows a sitter holding a small jewel box, and we see the same person, as if in mirrors, frontally as well as twice in profile. One reason may be that Lotto was responding to a virulent debate during his time concerning the competition between painting and sculpture, the latter arguably providing more than one perspective. Another may be a play on the sitter's hometown, Treviso, 3 views. In any case, the crucial point is that these readings are not mutually exclusive, but suggest a conscious overdetermination, that more layers of meaning might be at stake. Things that seem arbitrary take on significance, or things that may mean one thing may suddenly mean the opposite. One can read this as the pastime of the educated, as sophisticated innuendo. But at the same time, it's the kind of read between the line tactics well known from any period or place of society where free expression is not in order. And codification as sophistication on the one hand, and as critique circumventing censorship on the other, are not mutually exclusive. I return also to that point when we talk about the individual depicted. But back to Lucrezia for the moment. We see a woman in expensive, intensively colorful attire looking at us while holding in her left hand a picture of Lucrezia, a fact that is underlined in the painting by a cartellino placed on the table under that depiction, stating Lucrezia's declaration that no unchaste woman shall live if she follows her example. At first, the meaning and purpose of the painting seem very clear. We have no record who the sitter was, but one would assume that simply her name was Lucrezia, which was actually quite a common name in Venice, and that she was a married woman, thus underlining her ethics of defending marital fidelity at all costs, following the example of her namesake. But if that was the case, why does she strike such a dynamic, daring pose? Something that at the time was seen as exclusively masculine and thus unfit for courteous women. Why is her precious necklace not placed around her neck, but tucked in the cleavage of her dress, as if given to her in a somewhat lascivious manner, or at least misplaced because of unruly behavior? Why is there a little bunch of wallflower placed on the table next to the note? None of these attributes really add up, to say the least, to illustrate the character of a chaste wife, even though there are elements that point towards the portraiture of a married woman. Instead, they seem, in short, to indicate the opposite, that the sitter might have been a courtesan, a high-class courtesan. Her posture uncourteous, her necklace possibly a compensation by a wealthy client, the wallflower a rather ambivalent symbol of signifying either earthly or sacred love. But why should she, if she had been the commissioner of the painting, present herself as ironically mocking the ideals of married women's chastity? That doesn't make any sense too. Wouldn't she rather try to present herself, as it has been the case at least at times in the Republic of Venice during the 15th century, where courtesans could rise to being accepted as members of an elite society, as a restrained, dignified, rather cultured person, as many courtesans actually were very well educated or even published poets. And even more so, if she was in fact a married woman, not a courtesan. We know the story of Lucrezia from Titus Livius' account, and from the beginning of the Roman Republic, and the story is from the beginning of the Roman Republic around 540 before Christ. Lucrezia stabbed herself with a dagger upon having been raped by Sextus Tarquinius, son of the Etruscan king. Her deed not only made her the iconic figure of chastity, sacrificing her life to restore her honor, a motif that became quite common during the Renaissance, again, often emblazoned, as in this case of Botticelli's tragedy of Lucrezia. On a traditional marriage chest, a cassone, which was a sort of wedding gift amongst rich families. For it was the combination of sextus hubris, the tyrannic self-entitlement of violating and owning whatever you fancy, not least women, and of Lucretia's heroic self-sacrificial act that allegedly sparked the upheavals that led to the downfall of the Roman monarchy and the establishment of the Roman Republic. For our discussion, it is important to note that the relative liberation of the people of Rome came at a price. Not only was monarchic tyranny not replaced by the full emancipation of the citizens, but a kind of oligarchy of the rich and powerful men, but also that women or slaves had no stake in this emancipation of the male adult citizen. That price is also reflected in the fact that Lucretia is a strange symbol of liberation of the people, in that her heroic act is directed against herself, not, as in the case of Judith decapitating Holofernes, something I will return to as well, against an oppressor. Also, her act has often been strangely eroticized, as if the explicit proclamation of the ideal of chastity worked as a legitimization for implicit pornography, the dagger directed against the naked body, not only a phallus in some symbolic term, but a very literal echo of forced sexual penetration. This eroticization, in turn, was motivated by the typical rape culture argument that the women in question might have enticed and even enjoyed it after all, an argument that actually Augustinus already made, several pages explaining why Lucretia must have been in on it, because otherwise she wouldn't have committed suicide, but rather tried to kill the other person, etc. Because of course, in the Christian, I was about to say ideology, yes, in the Christian ideology, suicide was of course a mortal sin. One should also mention that Boccaccio in the 14th century included Lucretia in his stories about famous women. So that way she became sort of a well-known figure, again in the Renaissance. One cannot help but think that Lucas Cranach the Elder's incessant return to the motif of a fully naked or thinly veiled Lucretia with a dagger from the 1520s on, there are 34 canvases that are known, reflected the strange ambivalence between official trope of virtue and unofficial vista of lust, between the private conviction of chastity and the public politics of self-sacrificial resistance to tyranny, as in the case of the historic Lucretia, almost as if precisely dwelling on that point of ambivalence in a sophisticated duping of conventions in regard to both erotics and politics. But something about that explanation doesn't really suffice. Let me try to explain why. Cranach, of course, was a friend of Martin Luther, and this is where the story becomes even more strange and to some extent inevitably slightly speculative. For Luther used the very same motif of Lucretia with the dagger as a frontispiece for some of his published Bible commentaries. In one instance, for example, in 1531, that's 2 years before the Lucretia portrait I showed you, Lucretia is not as obviously eroticized as in Cranach. Instead, the emphasis is clearly on the idea of standing in at all costs for your religious beliefs and corresponding ethical standards. Lucretia, it could be said, here becomes what Shakespeare called the earthly saint, that only on a secondary level stands in for marital fidelity, if at all, but firstly represents the Protestant challenge to the papal dynastic rule of the Borgia and its conceived tyrannical depravity. Which brings us back to Lorenzo Lotto. To this day, Venice has remained the longest-lasting republic, already 800 years old during the days of Lorenzo Lotto. It was a proud state, versed in resisting the attempts to challenge its power by neighboring kingdoms and dukeships. During the 16th century, arguably under the influence of German merchants, it was also the home of a substantial Lutheran community of at times more than 5,000 members. And it also has still today the oldest Lutheran church in Italy, founded already in the late, it was in the early 17th century. But the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, which the Venetians built as a kind of today you would say a city marketing tool to the German merchants right next to Rialto Bridge in 1506. They sort of had a sort of unofficial sort of free zone there for Lutherans too. So it was kind of not officially accepted, but it was kind of overlooked for a certain period until the Roman Inquisition hit quite hard in the mid-16th century. But until then, there were clandestine Lutheran congregations already, very shortly after they occurred in Germany. To come back to that painting, as has been proven by inquisitorial records of the 1570s, the goldsmith depicted here, Bartolomeo Carpan, back in 1530, several decades later, turned out to be the leader of that community, clandestine even in the relative tolerance of Venice, and he was subjected to the Inquisition. That was already after the death of Lotto himself, who died in 1556. But, well, you could say, well, he just happened to have portrayed this guy, but he was also friends with his two brothers from Treviso, so they were close friends. So in other words, Lotto must have been a close friend with the leader of the Lutheran community in Venice. What's more, in his account book that Lotto kept from the late 1530s to his death, he meticulously took down note of every single penny he earned or lost or someone owed him. And there's an entrance that at some point in the 1540s, he committed to copying the famous Cranach double portrait of Luther and his wife, which from the point of view of church orthodoxy added insult to injury, a priest who had wedded and proudly sat for paintings as such. This was presumably on commission to one member of the Lutheran community of Venice. All of these factors taken together suggest that Lotto's use of the Lucrezia motif in 1533 might have double or triple meanings beyond the enunciation of either chastity and marital fidelity, or a sort of ironic play on their devaluation by a courtesan. As said, at around the same time Luther used the motif, the Basel-based reformer Heinrich Bullinger used it too. He wrote in 1526-28 a play about Lucretia that combined the portrayal of her virtuousness with scenes illustrating the exploitation of the peasants by the tyrannical king. Hans Sachs, the famous Meistersinger of Nuremberg, also wrote and staged a one-act play called Von der Lucrezia, of Lucretia, in the 1540s, while he was told off by the authorities of Nuremberg for alleged arousing anti-Catholic sentiment. Bible commentaries and other texts by Luther, which is also crucial to note, were circulating freely in Venice in the 1520s and 30s, not yet shut down by Rome, as it happened from the 1540s on. So that's also very important to note, that in Venice, Luther's writing were freely available. And also, by the way, there was an exodus of courtesans from Rome around 1526, as there the Vatican had had a crackdown on prostitution, fueled not least by its own congregates. Their infliction with prostitution, of course. Another indication that Lucretia was more than just a symbol of virtue and chastity. The city of Regensburg, as it became a Protestant renegade from otherwise firmly Catholic Bavaria, chose Lucretia as a symbol of its resistance. However, it could also be said that by the time more and more Lutherans used the Lucretia motif as a code for resistance against Rome, Lucretia was also couched as a kind of celebration of Lucretia's virtue, not as an invitation to revolt. In other words, she was not Judith. Could it be that, revolt in the sense of taking to arms? Could it be that while the sitter may have been an actual courtesan being put into relation to the Lucretia figure, might it at the same time herself have been an allegory for the state of things in the Venetian Republic, awkwardly caught as she is between chair and table, between a rock and a hard place, so to speak? Could it be that the Lucrezia motif evokes the idea of the Republican founding myth, standing up against tyranny over her dead body, to cite the title of Elizabeth Bronfman's book from the 90s, at the same time as alluding to the proliferation of heretic beliefs in 1530s Venice, alluding in fact to Venice's status as a republic itself. A portrait of Venice as a stronghold of republican stamina against attempts of influence by kingdoms as well as the church, not least also in regard to religious tolerance, but also not a full identification with Lucrezia herself or with Protestantism itself, pointed at in representation, not impersonated. Maybe I'm reading too much into this painting. Maybe it's all just coincidence, the ambivalence of the figure between chastity and voluptuousness and the layers of meaning the Lucrezia figure herself represent. But in any case, I find it necessary to explore the Lucrezia myth in regard to a new role it might have taken on for Protestant heretics, not least in Italy, not least in Venice, with some of which Lotto was arguably in contact. Namely, that of an allegory of protest, resistance, and liberty, denoting ethical virtuousness combined with a political willingness to stand up against tyranny. Did Lucrezia in 16th century Europe serve as a twisted, coded saint of resistance? Well, was Lotto a Protestant then? Very likely not. But our conceptions of today were not even yet on the horizon. At that point, Luther was a heretic amongst numerous others. His questioning of certain doctrines could set the minds going of the more intellectually inclined believers, not in the sense that they would reject the church as such, but see it as a way to strengthen its cause. So there was a whole discussion in Bergamo, for example, for several decades where people said, okay, what this Luther says is actually quite interesting, we have to reform the church, but not in the sense that Luther was more fundamentally, of course, trying to reform it. So it's well possible that Lotto was, and Lotto spent a lot of time in Bergamo, so it's well possible that Lotto was a devoted believer and considering devoted believer in the Orthodox sense and considering Luther's thinking. But that became an increasingly dangerous thing to do from the 1530s on. Lutherans amongst the Italian population of Venice were increasingly at danger to be imprisoned, tortured, or in fact drowned in the lagoon, which happened several times from the 1540s on. Maybe Lotto was one of the so-called Nicodemians who led a double life. Not his style, though. He could even upset his very commissioners, as in this case, the Dominican order. Lorenzo Lotto, the Alms of St. Antoninus, 1542, still today in the Santi Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. This painting was commissioned already around 1526, but wasn't accepted and finalized until 1542, which you also know from his account book. In the almost 16 years in between, different friars asked for alterations and voiced concerns, the exact nature of which we don't know. They didn't seem to be very happy with it. However, looking at the results still hanging there, one can't help but think that the Dominicans, of course, noticed the critical subtext of the painting. I'm very sorry that's small, so you will have to trust me when I describe it, or my reading of it. Here we have the patron saint of charity, giving alms, sitting on a fat throne up there, with sacks of money at his feet, money and gold, as one of his underlings, so to speak, gives out a few coins with a smug smile on his face. I see it as a smug smile, while the other one takes some and rejects most letters of request. It was, after all, a Dominican, Johann Tetzel, who had caused Luther to rail against that way of buying your way into heaven, solicited by priests and friars. Well, in any case, Lotto was not taking the easy way, that's for sure. A painter surely as talented and refined as many of his peers, he died a poor man in a Dominican cloister. He returned to the arms of the order of the Catholic Church. Maybe because he had already experienced so much surprising rejection in his profession. After 2 years of having worked in the stanzas in Rome, the Pope disliked his designs and had Raphael paint them over. We don't know why the Pope reacted that way. Maybe it was simply that Raphael was seen as the more refined artist, which in regard to fresco, he probably was. But in regard to painting, and especially portraiture, it's still puzzling that Lotto didn't have anything close to the status of, for example, Titian. In fact, he was more or less forgotten at all well into the 19th century. Many of his paintings had been ascribed to Giorgione, or to Da Vinci, in fact, before Bernard Berenson in the 1870s almost single-handedly put Lotto back on the map. But why had he vanished? He has variously been described as a difficult character with a strong religious dedication. Maybe part of that difficulty was a restless mind looking for other answers, and the ones brought up by Luther were once to be seriously considered. Even in coded, read between the lines ways as to not upset your clients, lest be thrown in prison. But why Lucrezia, not Judith? Lucrezia, as opposed to the biblical Judith, is not killing her enemy, but herself. Her sexuality being in doubt is the cause of her suicidal act and perversely becomes the spark for revolution. We know that Luther discussed both the biblical Judith as well as the pagan, pre-Christian Lucrezia as examples of virtuous women, both in dinner conversations that have been noted as well as in Bible commentaries. In 1504, members of the Senate of Florence condemned Donatello's famous sculpture of Judith killing Holofernes on the grounds that it endorsed and was symbolic of the killing of a man by a woman. It is this figure of denial or sacrifice that is the troubled kernel of all allegories of freedom. One people's liberty has all too often implied the exploitation or elimination of another. This is Cranach's Judith from 1530 in the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna. Moreover, this very mechanism is phantasmatically inscribed in these figures. The fact that they are women connoted with virile, wild qualities almost automatically, at least historically, means that women and the wild, other often exoticized or repudiated ethnicities, are precisely excluded from the claim to resistance, liberation, liberty, connoted with that very allegory. But one could argue that nevertheless the existence of such an allegory per se potentially opens up a crack in this perverse phantasmatic tension, which is why depicting Judith could be seen as a threat, as by the authorities of Florence, and depicting Lucrezia arguably also, but maybe less. So this, for example, is an illustration of a Lucrezia song from Hans Sachs, published in 1560, where, strangely, the dagger is as big as Judith's sword, which is why I chose that image. So, to come to a conclusion, or not really a conclusion, but sort of that's the point where I'm at the moment with my little pet subject. How can we establish that Lotto's Lucrezia that we've seen in the beginning really connotes all these things that I keep speculating about? The Lucrezia motif, after all, had been there before. Titian's Lucrezia and her husband from 1515, also in the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna. So here we have the equation, here we have the question of chastity, of virtue in its clear form, with this kind of otherworldly gaze, and her husband whispering to her from her back, but already eroticized. This is Palma Vecchio, who was a friend of Lorenzo Lotto, a close friend. Young lady in green dress, 1512, also in the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna. The state of undress suggests, or rather dictates, that the sitter can't possibly be a chaste, a married woman or bride, since otherwise letting herself be sitting for a painter for a longer period, depicted this way, would have already suspended that status. So in fact, many of the women who sat for Venetian painter and many other Renaissance painter, I'm sure, at the time, whether they depicted saints or antique figures, were in fact prostitutes. Because for other women, it was not possible to do that without losing their chastity. Paris Bordone, Venetian lovers, 1525 to 30, Pinacoteca di Bera in Milan. Bordone was a close friend of Parma Vecchio, who, as I mentioned, was a close friend of Lotto, so I guess they also knew each other, but at least they had one friend in common. And it's quite likely that they knew each other's works. Bordone was a friend, as I said. Well, here Lucrezia's husband is echoed, as we saw it in Titian, in the pale figure behind the shoulder, but instead of a dagger to her throat, the lady receives payment in the form of a collier. Venetian Lovers quite openly depicts the social mores of the day, how courtesans were an accepted part of high society, how they dressed the same way as married women, with the one exception that they weren't allowed to wear pearl necklaces, or any necklaces at all, at least not in public, as a distinction after confusion had set in the early 16th century, and people had complained how they should tell apart a courtesan from a married woman when they wore the same dresses. So this was at this point in period, and as I mentioned earlier, this is exactly the time when courtesans had an exodus from Rome to Venice because of the Pope's crackdown on prostitution in Rome. So this is the kind of comparison I make here and how certain aspects of all three of these paintings seem to be distilled into that one. In Lotto's portrait of a lady as Lucrezia, the chaste Lucrezia of antiquity in Titian, and the courtesans in both Parma Vecchio's and Paris Bordone's works seem to culminate in one motif. Dress color, a yellow torn veil, both here and here, the shadow of male violence and paternalist infliction, but also, and the shadow, I mean this here, because obviously at first you think, yeah, it's a shadow of a light coming there, but in fact it also alludes to a figure standing in a doorway. So it could sort of play, again, both ways in the sense of this paternalist figure that we have here and here in the back. Well, that shadow of male violence and paternalist infliction. But also the obvious paradoxy of women being subjected to a dual system in which they can either be virtuous but not participate in society, because a married woman was basically asked to stay at home. She was not part of the court. Or do so and be considered sinful. That was the strange, paradoxical social mores of the time. For Luther and his followers, Lucrezia was the allegory of resistance, which paradoxically excluded women from action. It was an allegory of resistance, which at the same time confirmed the patriarchal order, chosen to not support the uprising of the peasants, which Luther famously condemned, lest the political emancipation of women, which was still hundreds and hundreds of years away. Thank you very much.